They say the show must go on, but at whose expense? Danielle Spencer was 12 when a car crash crushed her pelvis and killed her protector. Hollywood didn't give her time to grieve. They didn't even give her time to walk. Driven by greed and the racist myth that black children don't feel pain, they forced her back on stage, dragging a broken spine behind her. While America laughed, she was screaming inside, and nobody listened. Memory is a seductive liar. It smooths over the rough edges of the past. It edits out the screams and amplifies the laughter until history becomes nothing more than a comforting loop of greatest hits. If you grew up in America during the late 1970s, or if you consumed its cultural exports in the decades that followed, your memory of Danielle Spencer is almost certainly wrapped in the warm, fuzzy glow of nostalgia. You remember her as Dee Thomas. You remember the pigtails. You remember the sharp tongue and the oversized eyes that could communicate a paragraph of judgment with a single glance. You remember the catchphrase that became a playground anthem across the Western world. "Oh, I'm telling Mama." When you hear that line in your head right now, you smile. It is a reflex. It is Pavlovian. That is the power of the sitcom. It is a machine designed to convert human behavior into a commodified product called joy. But I need you to stop smiling. I need you to freeze that frame in your mind. Look past the character. Look past the timing. Look at the child. What we are actually watching when we revisit what's happening is not just a comedy. It is a crime scene that has been tampered with. We are witnessing the systematic consumption of a black child's spirit. The studio's laugh track didn't just punctuate the jokes. It acted as a sonic shroud, burying the quiet gasps of a girl whose body was failing her in real time. But in the case of Danielle Spencer, that laugh track served a far more sinister purpose. It was a noise-canceling device. It was a wall of sound erected to drown out the reality of what was happening to her body. We have been conditioned to view child stars as tragic figures only when they spiral into addiction or criminality. When they rob convenience stores or drive cars off cliffs, we shake our heads and say Hollywood destroyed them. But Danielle Spencer did not rob a store. She did not overdose. She did exactly what she was told. She showed up. She hit her marks. She smiled. And because she was compliant, because she hid her agony behind that $1 million grin, we assumed she was fine. We were wrong. The tragedy of Danielle Spencer isn't that she fell from grace. It's that she was crushed by the weight of maintaining it. To understand why this happened, we have to confront a question that is uncomfortable, ugly, and absolutely necessary. Why was it allowed? If a 12-year-old Tatum O'Neal, the darling of Paper Moon and the youngest Oscar winner in history, had suffered a catastrophic spinal injury in 1977, would Paramount Pictures have forced her out of a wheelchair and onto a sound stage 6 months later? If a member of the Brady Bunch cast had their pelvis crushed in a collision that killed their guardian, would ABC have threatened to fire them if they didn't return to work while their bones were still knitting together? The answer, almost certainly, is no. The production would have halted. The nation would have held a vigil. Magazine covers would have featured tearful prayers for her recovery. The child would have been wrapped in cotton wool and given the dignity of convalescence. But Danielle Spencer was not white, and this distinction is the key that unlocks the entire horrifying narrative. We are looking at a phenomenon that sociologists and medical historians call the pain gap. It is a pervasive systemic bias rooted in the era of slavery and persisting well into the modern medical establishment that dictates whose pain is real and whose pain is theoretical. In the late 1970s, the Hollywood establishment operated on the unspoken racist assumption that black bodies were more durable, less sensitive, and fundamentally more expendable than white bodies. This is not hyperbole. It is historical fact. Since the 19th century, American medicine had fostered the myth that black people had thicker skin and less sensitive nerve endings than white people. This lie was originally invented to justify the brutalization of enslaved people, but it mutated and survived into the 20th century corporate world. When the executives looked at Danielle Spencer, they didn't see a fragile preteen girl. Through the lens of this bias, they saw a creature designed for endurance. Her resilience wasn't seen as a virtue, but as a raw resource. To the executives, Danielle wasn't a wounded child. She was a damaged asset, one final squeeze of value before the write-off. We are not just telling the story of a car crash. We are telling the story of a collision between a vulnerable girl and an industrial complex that viewed her humanity as an inconvenience. This is an indictment of a system that was willing to mortgage a child's future health for present-day ratings. And the receipt for that transaction is written on Danielle Spencer's spine. Let's rewind the tape. Before the crash, before the cane, before the paralysis. Let's go back to 1976. The United States was celebrating its bicentennial. It was a year of aggressive patriotism and desperate optimism. The country was trying to wash off the stains of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. In the realm of pop culture, there was a quiet revolution happening. Television networks, realizing the immense untapped purchasing power of African Americans, began to pivot. They needed black faces, but they needed a specific kind of black face. They didn't want the anger of the Black Panthers. They didn't want the radical intellectualism of James Baldwin. They wanted safety. They wanted comfort. They wanted the token. Into this carefully curated vacuum walked Danielle Spencer. When What's Happening premiered, it was positioned as a black version of American Graffiti, a look at high school life in Los Angeles. But the show carried a burden that Happy Days or the Brady Bunch never had to shoulder. Every joke, every plot line, every outfit was scrutinized. They weren't just representing a demographic, they were representing a race. Danielle, at 11 years old, was the breakout star. She was the black gem. But being a gem in a white machine is a dangerous existence. While the studio executives were popping champagne over the ratings, the contracts told a different story. If you compare the financial ecosystem of What's Happening to its white counterparts, the disparity is nauseating. The child stars of the Brady Bunch, which had aired just a few years prior, were protected by a fortress of legal safeguards, standardized pay scales, and a residual structure that ensured they would benefit from reruns for decades. They were treated as investments to be nurtured. Their sets were playgrounds. Their tutors were top tier. Their hours were strictly regulated by unions that watched white productions like hawks. Danielle and her castmates lived in a different reality. They were treated as gig workers. Their contracts were predatory. The black discount was real. They were paid significantly less than white child actors, with a fraction of their screen time or cultural impact. The studio logic was circular and cynical. You should be grateful just to be here. This economic leverage is crucial to understanding the physical abuse that came later. When you are underpaid and constantly reminded of your replaceability, you do not complain. You do not ask for time off. You internalize the idea that your presence is a privilege, not a right. Danielle was carrying the weight of representation on her small shoulders. She knew even at 11 that she couldn't just be good. She had to be undeniable. She had to be twice as funny, twice as sharp, and twice as disciplined just to keep her seat at the table. She was working in an environment where one mistake, one difficult moment, could confirm the biases of the white executives running the show. She was performing on a tightrope without a safety net, unaware that the people holding the rope were waiting for her to fall. In the dictionary of Hollywood stereotypes, the sassy black child is a lucrative entry. It is a trope that comforts white audiences because it reduces the black experience to a punchline. It strips away the threat and leaves only the entertainment. Danielle Spencer was a prodigy of timing. Her delivery of, "Ooh, I'm telling mama," was not just a line reading. It was a masterclass in comedic rhythm. But to the producers, this talent was a commodity to be strip-mined. The industry didn't just market her talent, they weaponized her childhood. Every ooh she delivered was a withdrawal from her physical bank account, a transaction where the studio took the gold and left her with the debt of a failing spine. If the doll gets damaged, you don't weep. You try to glue it back together so it can talk again. In 1976 and early 1977, Danielle was the ultimate doll. She was paraded through talk shows and magazine covers. The press loved her attitude. They called her precocious. They called her firecracker. But these words were double-edged swords. By framing her as tough, as feisty, as full of attitude, the media was subconsciously preparing the public to believe that she didn't need protection. Cute, white children like Shirley Temple or the kids from the Waltons were framed as fragile angels who needed to be shielded from the harsh world. Their tears were tragic. Their injuries were national emergencies. Danielle Spencer was framed as a miniature adult who could handle herself. This is what sociologists call the adultification bias. Studies have shown that adults view black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than white girls of the same age, often starting as young as 5 years old. This perception was the psychological groundwork for what was to come. Because she was tough on screen, the producers assumed she was tough in real life. Because her character Dee Thomas could talk her way out of any situation, they assumed Danielle Spencer could endure any hardship. When a white child cries, the instinct is to comfort. When a black child portrayed as sassy cries, the instinct, tragically, is often to check if they are faking it or to tell them to be strong. They were pricing her innocence. They calculated exactly how much ad revenue her smile could generate, but they assigned a value of 0 to her physical well-being. She was bringing in millions of dollars for ABC, yet she was essentially an indentured servant to the script, and she was oblivious. She was a child who loved acting. She loved the applause. She trusted the directors, the producers, and the handlers. She believed that if she worked hard and made people laugh, she would be taken care of. She didn't know that she was feeding a beast that would eventually eat her alive. The tragedy of 1976 is that we can see the train coming, and she cannot. We see the machine revving up. We see the gears grinding. We see a little girl dancing on the edge of a volcano thinking it's a spotlight. And just around the corner, on a highway in Malibu, the darkness was waiting to cash in on all that calculated negligence. September 7th, 1977. It was a Wednesday, the kind of late summer day in Southern California that feels like a promise of eternal sunshine, where the light hits the ocean with a clarity that makes the rest of the world feel dull by comparison. The air was warm, smelling faintly of salt and exhaust. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched out like a ribbon between the towering, dusty Santa Monica Mountains and the glittering blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It is a stretch of road famous for its breathtaking beauty, a place where convertibles drive with tops down and radios playing, But it is also infamous for its deceptive danger, a winding, unforgiving path where the margin for error is measured in inches. Danielle Spencer was 12 years old. She was strapped into the passenger seat of a car driven by Tim Pelt. They were heading toward Malibu. To the casual observer, they looked like a father and daughter enjoying a midweek drive. The exact destination has been lost to history, obscured by the catastrophe that was seconds away, but the mood was likely light. Danielle was at the peak of her fame, a child living a dream. But dreams in Hollywood are fragile things. What happened next was not a scene from a sitcom. There was no laugh track to soften the blow. There was no director to yell, "Cut." There was only the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of kinetic energy meeting human frailty. We often talk about car accidents in abstract, sanitized terms. We say a crash occurred or a collision took place. But to understand the trauma imprinted on Danielle Spencer's body and soul, we must strip away the euphemisms and look at the raw physics of that moment. When two vehicles traveling at highway speeds collide head-on, the violence is incomprehensible to the human mind until it is too late. In the split second of impact, time seems to warp. The laws of motion, which usually govern our lives invisibly, suddenly become executioners. The car didn't just stop, it was violently arrested by an opposing force of equal magnitude. The kinetic energy, having nowhere to go, traveled through the machine and into its occupants. The metal of the chassis screamed as it buckled, folding inward like paper. Glass shattered, transforming instantly into thousands of crystalline shrapnel projectiles filling the cabin. The roar of the collision was a cacophony of destruction, the sound of steel tearing, rubber burning, and the horrifying silence that immediately follows. Inside the cabin, the human bodies were subjected to G-forces that anatomy was never designed to withstand. Danielle, a small 12-year-old frame with bones that were still growing, was thrown forward against the restraints with bone-crushing velocity. The illusion of safety, the bubble of celebrity, the bright future, it all evaporated in a haze of radiator steam and twisted metal on the side of the PCH. The child star Dee Thomas ceased to exist in that moment. Only Danielle Spencer, a terrified, broken little girl trapped in a mangle of wreckage, remained. But the physics of the crash is only half the story. The other half is a tale of unimaginable heroism and blinding tragedy that would haunt Danielle for the rest of her life. Driving the car was Tim Pelt. To the public, Tim was a familiar face, a working actor known for playing Danielle's father on What's Happening in several episodes. But in the insulated, often lonely world of a child actor, he was far more than a colleague or a plot device. Tim Pelt wasn't just a co-star, he was the primary shield in a world of predators. When the steel buckled, he didn't recoil, he dove. He traded his 36 years of life for her 12, turning his own body into the final barrier between Danielle and the grave Tim. Pelt died instantly in the wreckage of that car. He was 36 years old. He saved her life. But the life he saved was now inextricably bound to his death. Imagine the psychological weight of that reality landing on the psyche of a preteen. This is the genesis of survivor's guilt in its purest, most agonizing form. Danielle Spencer did not just survive a car crash. She survived because someone she loved died in her place. This is a trauma that digs deeper than any broken bone. It is a spiritual wound, a debt that can never be repaid, creating a desperate, unspoken need to prove that her life was worth the sacrifice. It instilled a belief that she owed the world and perhaps the industry her compliance, her silence, and her good behavior as a form of penance. When the jaws of life cut her out of the scrap metal that used to be a car, she was alive because of Tim Pelt. But as the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher, stabilizing her neck and racing against time, her body was a landscape of utter ruin. To understand the crime that Hollywood would commit against Danielle Spencer in the months to come, we must unflinchingly examine the medical reality of her body on the afternoon of September 7th. We cannot glaze over this. We must look at the clinical details, because the executives who later ordered her back to work certainly knew them, and they chose to ignore them. Danielle's body was shattered. This is not a metaphor. It was a physiological catastrophe. The primary point of devastation was her pelvis. The human pelvis is the architectural anchor of the body. It connects the spine to the lower limbs. It supports the weight of the torso. It protects vital organs. It is a ring of bone designed to be incredibly strong. To break a pelvis requires immense, violent force, the kind usually seen in high-altitude falls or industrial accidents. Danielle's pelvis did not just crack, it fractured in multiple places. The pelvic ring was compromised. Imagine the foundation of a house crumbling. This injury meant that any movement, sitting up, rolling over, even the act of breathing deeply, sent shock waves of blinding agony through her core. The stability of her entire skeletal structure was gone. Muscles that attached to the pelvis, which control leg movement and posture, were now pulling on broken shards of bone. Compounding this was a severe compound fracture of her leg. The femur, the strongest bone in the human body, was snapped. Her arm was broken. She was a constellation of fractures, a map of blunt force trauma. But the most insidious injuries, the ones that would dictate the rest of her life and form the basis of her future torture on set, were invisible to the naked eye. The force of the crash had whipped her neck and torso with such violence that it caused profound trauma to her spinal column. The spine is a delicate, stacked column of vertebrae protecting the spinal cord, the superhighway of the nervous system. The crash caused severe damage to the discs between her vertebrae, particularly in the lumbar region, the lower back that bears the most weight. These discs, which act as shock absorbers, were ruptured or herniated. When a disc herniates, the soft inner material leaks out and presses directly onto the sensitive nerve roots, exiting the spine. This is not an ache. This is neuropathic pain. It creates a sensation that patients describe as lightning striking inside the body or burning oil being poured down the leg. It is relentless, agonizing, and terrifying. It causes muscle weakness, numbness, and loss of reflex. For a 12-year-old girl, it must have felt like her own body had turned against her, betraying her with every heartbeat. Furthermore, the trauma caused damage that would lead to severe spinal stenosis, a narrowing of the spinal canal that slowly strangles the nerves. This is a progressive condition, a ticking time bomb planted in her back in 1977 that would go off decades later. And finally, the head trauma. The violent deceleration caused her brain to slam against the inside of her skull. She developed a hematoma, a bleed on the brain. While she survived the immediate danger, traumatic brain injuries in children are notoriously complex. They leave invisible scars on cognition, emotion, and neurological function that can take years to fully manifest. This was the child that was rushed into the emergency room, not a sassy sitcom star, but a broken vessel. A 12-year-old girl whose skeleton had been pulverized, whose nervous system was screaming, and whose brain was bleeding. Danielle slipped into a coma. For 3 weeks, she hovered in the gray zone between life and death. The coma is a thief of time. Outside her hospital room, the world kept turning noisy and intrusive. The press reported on the crash with the breathless sensationalism reserved for celebrity tragedy. Headlines screamed, "TV child star critical." Fans sent letters by the thousands. The studio executives paced in their offices, not necessarily out of grief, but worrying about production schedules, insurance payouts, and the future of their hit show. But inside the intensive care unit, there was only the sterilized silence of survival. For 21 days, Danielle Spencer was absent from the world. Her body, encased in plaster casts from chest to toe, strung up in traction with metal pins holding her shattered bones in alignment, fought a silent battle to keep functioning. The only sounds were the rhythmic wheeze of the ventilator and the monotonous beep of the heart monitor, the soundtrack of a life hanging in the balance. During those 3 weeks, her body began the slow, painful process of knitting itself back together, but the damage was already done. The nerves were compressed. The scarred tissue was forming. The structural integrity of her spine was permanently altered. Then she woke up. Waking up from a coma is not like in the movies, where the patient flutters their eyes open and speaks a coherent sentence. It is a slow, confusing ascent from deep water. It is a fog of disorientation. And for 12-year-old Danielle, consciousness brought with it 2 unbearable realities that hit her simultaneously, crashing down on her before she could even process where she was. The first was pain. Pain that was absolute and all-encompassing. The morphine drip could dull the edges, but it couldn't erase the fact that her pelvic girdle was broken and her nerves were on fire. She was trapped in a body she no longer recognized, unable to move, bound to a hospital bed by gravity and plaster. She was a prisoner in her own skin. The second reality was worse. It was the moment the doctors, or perhaps her mother, had to break the news. The question she surely asked, "Where is Tim?" was met with a devastating answer. Tim is gone. The man who had been laughing with her minutes before the lights went out was dead. And he was dead because he saved her. The guilt washed over her as paralyzing as her physical injuries. At 12 years old, she had to process grief, trauma, and the crushing physical reality that she might never walk again, all while navigating the realization that her survival had come at the highest possible price. She was a broken child in a hospital bed, facing a year, perhaps 2, of grueling rehabilitation just to learn how to sit up without screaming. Any humane society, any compassionate industry would have looked at this devastated little girl and said, "Stop, rest, take all the time you need, we will wait for you. Your health is the only thing that matters." But Danielle Spencer did not work in a humane industry. She worked in Hollywood. And as she lay in that hospital bed attempting to comprehend the ruin of her life, the machine that owned her image was already calculating. They weren't calculating her recovery time. They were calculating how fast they could patch her up, drug her up, and get her back in front of a camera. The laughter had stopped for Danielle, but the show, no matter the cost in human misery, had to go on. The silence of the hospital room did not last. It was broken not by the sound of healing, but by the ringing of a telephone. It had been barely 6 months since the crash on the Pacific Coast Highway. 6 months since Tim Pelt died. 6 months since Danielle Spencer's pelvis was crushed and her spine was whipped like a rag doll. In the timeline of orthopedic recovery, 6 months is a blink of an eye. For a child with compound fractures and deep neurological trauma, it is merely the beginning of the beginning. Her bones were still knitting, her muscles were atrophied, her nerves were raw, firing confused signals of agony to a brain that was still processing the grief of loss. But in the high-rise offices of ABC and the production companies that owned what's happening, the calendar looked different. To the executives, 6 months was an eternity of lost revenue. The show was a hit. It was a ratings juggernaut. And in the cold binary logic of television production, a hit show cannot have its breakout star sitting in a rehabilitation center. This is where the tragedy of an accident transforms into the premeditation of a crime. The decision to bring Danielle Spencer back to the set in 1978 was not a celebration of her resilience. It was a calculated act of industrial cruelty. Imagine the boardroom meeting where this decision was made. Picture the men in suits, surrounded by ashtrays and rating charts. They were not discussing a 12-year-old girl named Danielle. They were discussing an asset named Dee Thomas. They looked at the numbers. They looked at the contracts. And they made a choice that prioritized the delivery of a sitcom episode over the structural integrity of a child's spine. They decided that she was well enough. Not well enough to play, not well enough to run, but well enough to be propped up in front of a camera and recite lines. They viewed her body as a piece of equipment that had been damaged in transit, something to be patched up with duct tape and glue, just enough to get through the warranty period. To understand how they could justify this moral atrocity to themselves, we must confront the elephant in the room: medical racism. We have to speak the ugly truth that has permeated American history from the plantations of the South to the sound stages of Hollywood. There is a pervasive, insidious myth in Western medicine, one that was explicitly taught in medical schools for centuries and subconsciously persisted into the 1970s, that black people do not feel pain the same way white people do. It is a lie born of slavery, used to justify the brutalization of black bodies for labor. It suggested that black skin was thicker, that black nerve endings were less sensitive, that the black constitution was designed for suffering. If Danielle Spencer had been a white child star, if she had been Melissa Gilbert on Little House on the Prairie or a daughter on the Waltons, the narrative would have been one of fragility. The industry would have viewed her broken body with a sense of sacred protection. The insurance companies would have refused to clear her. The public would have demanded she rest. But Danielle was black, and through the distorted lens of systemic racism, her pain was discounted. Her trauma was minimized. The executives looked at a girl who had survived a fatal car crash and didn't see a miracle. They saw a workhorse. They assumed she could take it. They assumed that because she wasn't screaming, she wasn't hurting. They weaponized her silence against her. So the order came down: get her back on set. The return of Danielle Spencer to What's Happening stands as one of the most grotesque examples of child exploitation in entertainment history. The set became a torture chamber disguised as a playground. The physical reality of her workday in 1978 is the stuff of nightmares. Danielle could not walk without excruciating difficulty. Her pelvis, the center of gravity for the human body, was a landscape of healing fractures. Every step sent a jolt of electricity up her spine. The production adapted, but not to help her heal, only to hide her injury. They altered the blocking, the movement of actors on stage. If you watch the episodes from this period closely, you will see a disturbing pattern. Dee Thomas is almost always sitting down. She is sitting on the couch. She is sitting at the kitchen table. She is leaning against a counter. But the camera doesn't show what happened between takes. Witnesses and later accounts describe a gruesome ritual. Danielle would be wheeled onto the soundstage in a wheelchair, her face ashen, her eyes dull with the fatigue of chronic pain. When the lights came on, she would be physically lifted out of the chair by crew members because her legs were too weak to support her weight for long periods. They would position her like a mannequin. And then the drugs. To get a 12-year-old girl with a broken back to smile on cue, you cannot rely on willpower alone. You need chemistry. Danielle was subjected to a regimen of painkillers and anti-inflammatories that would have staggered a grown man. There are accounts of injections, cortisone shot directly into the inflamed tissues to numb the screaming nerves, or stronger analgesics to create a chemical fog thick enough to mask the agony. Imagine the biological violence of this. Pain is the body's alarm system. It is the brain screaming, "Oh, stop, you are hurting me, let me heal." By silencing that alarm with drugs and forcing her to perform, the studio was overriding her body's natural defense mechanisms. They were forcing her to grind bone against bone, to compress damaged discs, to inflame torn ligaments, all while the chemicals lied to her brain and told her it was okay. And then the director would yell, "Action!" In that split second, Danielle Spencer had to perform a miracle. She had to suppress the tears. She had to ungrit her teeth. She had to summon the sparkling, sassy persona of Dee Thomas. She had to deliver the punchline. She had to laugh. "Oh, I'm telling Mama." The audience laughed. The producers smiled. The money rolled in. Cut. And the moment the camera stopped, the smile would vanish, replaced by a mask of sheer exhaustion. She would collapse back into the waiting arms of the crew or into her wheelchair, her small body trembling from the effort of existing. This was not acting. This was endurance. This was a child soldier marching on a broken leg because the general demanded a victory parade. But the physical torture was only one prong of the assault. The other was psychological and economic terrorism. A child in pain will eventually complain. A child, no matter how stoic, will eventually say, "I can't do this anymore." The studio needed to ensure that Danielle never said those words. They needed to ensure her total, unquestioning compliance. And in 1978, they found the perfect weapon to terrify her: the destruction of Fred Berry. Fred Berry, who played the character Rerun, was the other breakout star of the show. He was an adult, and he was watching what was happening. He saw the disparity in pay. He saw how the cast was being treated like second-class citizens compared to their white counterparts on other networks. He saw Danielle suffering. Fred Berry led the cast in a demand for better wages and better working conditions. It was a righteous stand. He was asking for dignity. The studio's response was swift, brutal, and public. They didn't negotiate. They annihilated. They threatened to fire the entire cast. They threatened to cancel the show. They labeled the actors as ungrateful and troublemakers. For Danielle, watching this from her wheelchair, the message was clear and terrifying. She had already lost her TV father, Tim Pelt, to death. Now she was watching her TV brother, Fred Berry, being socially and professionally executed by the studio. The executives weaponized her own trauma against her. The implicit threat hung heavy in the air. "Look at what we are doing to Fred. If you complain about your back, if you say you are too tired, if you delay production by 1 hour, we will destroy you too. You will lose your job. Your family will lose this income. You will be nothing." This is a specific kind of trauma known as sanctuary trauma, when the place that is supposed to be your safe haven becomes the source of your danger. Danielle was trapped. She was trapped by her injuries. She was trapped by the contracts. She was trapped by the fear of being the reason everyone lost their jobs. So she learned the most dangerous lesson a child can learn. Silence is survival. She learned to dissociate. She learned to separate her mind from her body. When the pain in her spine became unbearable, she went somewhere else in her head. She became a professional patient and a professional performer simultaneously. The crew on set, the cameramen, the makeup artists, the lighting technicians, they all saw it. They saw the wheelchair. They saw the tears between takes. They saw the grimace of pain masked by makeup. But nobody stopped it. Why? Because of the culture of silence. Because in Hollywood, the star's a product, and the crew are factory workers. You don't stop the assembly line because a part is squeaking. You grease it and keep it moving. And there is the racial component again, hovering like a toxic cloud. The empathy that would have triggered an intervention for a white child simply wasn't there for Danielle. The pain gap meant that her suffering was normalized. It was viewed as an unfortunate circumstance, not an emergency. She's a trooper, they likely said. She's tough. She's tough. That phrase is the tombstone of black childhood innocence. It is the excuse used to deny comfort. It is the justification used to deny rest. By labeling her as tough, they absolve themselves of the responsibility to be gentle. Day after day, week after week, the grinding continued. The L4 and L5 vertebrae in her lower back, already damaged from the crash, were subjected to the compressive forces of sitting, standing, and moving on set. The spinal stenosis, the narrowing of the canal, was accelerated. The scar tissue built up layer by layer, turning her spinal cord into a choked, strangled wire. Every episode of What's Happening from this era is a documentary of abuse, if you know what to look for. When you see Dee Thomas sitting still, you are looking at a child who cannot stand. When you see her snapping a quick comeback, you are hearing a child who is desperate to get the line right so she can go back to the relief of the wheelchair. The audience at home ate it up. They loved Dee. They sent fan mail. They bought merchandise. They had no idea that their laughter was being purchased with the bone marrow of a little girl. By the time the show was canceled in 1979, the damage was permanent. The studio had extracted every ounce of value from her. They had squeezed the token until she was dry. And when the cameras finally turned off, they didn't offer her a lifetime of physical therapy. They didn't offer her a pension for her disability. They didn't offer an apology. They simply unlocked the door and let her limp away. Danielle Spencer left the set of What's Happening, not as a triumphant star, but as a survivor of a war. She carried with her a body that was decades older than her chronological age. She carried a spine that looked like it belonged to an elderly construction worker. And she carried the deep psychological scar of knowing that the adults in the room, the people who were supposed to protect her, had looked at her broken body and decided that the show was more important. This was not just negligence. This was not just a tough break. This was the systemic, racially motivated, and economically driven consumption of a human being. They broke her on the highway, and then they ground her to dust on the soundstage. And the silence that surrounded this crime was deafening. When the final episode of What's Happening aired in 1979, the applause died out. The laugh track, which had run on a continuous loop for 3 years, finally fell silent. And in that silence, Danielle Spencer discovered the truest, coldest nature of the industry that had consumed her childhood. For 3 years, she had been a star. She was a commodity, a household name, a face on lunch boxes and magazine covers. But the moment the cancellation notice was signed, the alchemy of Hollywood reversed itself instantly. The gold turned back into lead. The beloved daughter became an unemployed black teenager with a spinal injury. There's a term in manufacturing called planned obsolescence, designing a product with an artificially limited useful life so it will become unfashionable or no longer functional after a certain period. Danielle Spencer was the human embodiment of this concept. The studio had extracted the cuteness from her. They had extracted the sass. They had mined her youth. And now that she was growing up, now that her body was changing and her injuries were becoming harder to conceal, they simply discarded the husk. There was no severance package. There was no transition team to help a child actor reintegrate into the real world. And most criminally, there was no lifetime medical coverage for the catastrophic injuries she had sustained while on their payroll. The car crash that shattered her pelvis and spine happened while she was employed by the show. In a just world, or even in a unionized factory job, the employer would be liable for the lifelong maintenance of that injury. But Hollywood operates in a gray zone of morality where child actors are independent contractors, and empathy is a line item that can be cut to save budget. When Danielle limped off the lot for the last time, the medical bills didn't stop coming. The physical therapy wasn't finished. The spinal stenosis, the narrowing of the spinal canal caused by the trauma, was a progressive condition. It didn't care that the show was canceled. It didn't care that the checks stopped coming. It kept grinding. So as the 1980s dawned, a decade of excess, neon, and wealth, Danielle Spencer was left to navigate a terrifying new reality. She was a young black woman in America with a pre-existing condition, no steady income, and a body that felt decades older than it was. This is the era of the void. It is important to contrast her experience here with the white child stars of her generation. When a show like The Brady Bunch or The Partridge Family ended, there was often a safety net. There were spin-offs. There were development deals. There was a cultural infrastructure that wanted to see white children succeed, that viewed them as America's children. Danielle Spencer was not America's child. She was America's entertainment. And when the entertainment stopped, America looked away. This is the discard. It is a brutal, racialized phenomenon. The industry didn't know what to do with a black girl who was no longer a pickaninny caricature. They didn't have roles for complex, injured black young women. They wanted the sassy kid or they wanted nothing, so they chose nothing. For nearly a decade, Danielle vanished from the public eye. But while she was invisible to the cameras, she was fighting a war in private. Imagine waking up every morning in a body that feels like a cage. The pain in her lower back was a constant companion, a hum of agony that fluctuated between a dull ache and a sharp, stabbing scream. She had to learn how to manage this pain without the army of handlers and doctors the studio had provided when she was profitable. Now she was just another patient in the waiting room, navigating a healthcare system that, as we have established, systematically undertreats pain in black women. She watched as the residuals, the payments actors receive when their shows are re-aired, trickled in. But for black shows in the 70s and 80s, the residual structures were often predatory. The networks made millions syndicating what's happening, playing the reruns endlessly to new generations of laughing fans. Danielle saw pennies on the dollar. She was generating wealth for the very people who had broken her while she struggled to pay for the treatments to fix the break. It would have been easy to surrender. We have seen the script play out dozens of times. The child star, broken and abandoned, turns to heroin to numb the physical pain and the psychological betrayal. They turn to crime. They end up on the front page of the tabloids, a cautionary tale of too much, too soon. Hollywood almost expects this. In fact, the industry feeds on it. The tragic downfall is the final act of exploitation, where the media can feast on the carcass of the star they created. But Danielle Spencer refused to follow that script. She looked at the path of destruction that had claimed so many of her peers, and she made a radical choice. She chose to save herself. She realized that Hollywood was never going to love her. It was never going to heal her. It was a parasite that would take until there was nothing left. So she cut the parasite off. She turned her back on the cameras. She packed her bags. And she headed to the one place where she believed she could find dignity and purpose, Tuskegee University. Tuskegee is not just a school, it is a sanctuary. It is a historically Black university with a legacy of Black excellence and resilience. For Danielle, stepping onto that campus must have felt like exhaling after holding her breath for a decade. Here, she wasn't Dee Thomas. She wasn't the sassy kid. She wasn't a broken prop. She was a student. She was a mind. She was a young woman reclaiming her agency. She chose to study veterinary medicine. This choice is profound. It is the key to understanding the depth of her soul. Why, after enduring so much human cruelty, would she dedicate her life to animals? The answer lies in the nature of suffering. Animals suffer in silence. A dog with a broken leg, a horse with a fracture, a cat in distress, they cannot articulate their pain. They cannot say, "I hurt." They cannot hire a lawyer. They cannot give an interview to People magazine. They are entirely dependent on the empathy of the observer. They need someone who can look past the surface, read the subtle signs of distress, and offer healing hands without asking for anything in return. Danielle Spencer knew exactly what that felt like. For years, she had been that silent creature. She had been the girl smiling on camera while her spine screamed. She had been the pet of the network, performed for treats and punished for disobedience. She knew the isolation of unvoiced agony. By becoming a veterinarian, Dr. Danielle Spencer became the person she had needed when she was 12 years old. She became the healer who listens to the voiceless. She became the protector who doesn't care about ratings or schedules, but only about the cessation of pain. There is a beautiful, tragic poetry in this. The hands that Hollywood had forced to sign unjust contracts, the hands they had injected with drugs to keep them from trembling, were now using scalpels and sutures to save lives. She spent decades in this second life. She opened her own practice. She became a pillar of her community. To the dog owners and cat lovers who brought their pets to her, she wasn't a celebrity. She was just the doctor, the woman with the gentle touch, the woman who seemed to understand pain on a level that went beyond medical textbooks. But while her spirit soared, her body could not forget the past. The tragedy of orthopedic trauma is that it has a long memory. The bone doesn't just heal and forget. The scar tissue thickens. The arthritis sets in. The spinal canal, narrowed by the violence of 1977 and the abuse of 1978, continued to close in on her nerves. While she was standing in surgery, saving animals, her own legs were beginning to fail her again. The numbness was creeping back. The lightning in her back was striking more often. This is the cruelty of the discard. You can leave Hollywood, but if Hollywood broke your body, you take the wreckage with you. The industry had moved on. They were making new sitcoms with new Black children. Gary Coleman in Different Strokes, Emmanuel Lewis in Webster. They were feeding new grist into the mill. Meanwhile, Danielle was fighting a private battle against paralysis that was slowly, inevitably coming to claim her. In the late 90s and early 2000s, as she entered her 40s, The bill for her childhood stardom finally came due with catastrophic interest. The resilience that had carried her through veterinary school, that had allowed her to reinvent herself, was about to collide with the absolute physical limits of her damaged spine. She had built a fortress of dignity around herself. She had proven that she was more than a sitcom character. She had proven that a black woman could survive the meat grinder of fame and emerge as a scientist and a healer. But the body keeps the score, and the score was settled in blood and bone on the Pacific Coast Highway in 1977. No amount of degrees, no amount of willpower, and no amount of distance from Los Angeles could undo the physics of that crash. The darkness was returning, and this time there would be no Tim Pelt to shield her. This time she would have to face the collapse of her body alone. The void of the 80s and 90s was ending, not with a triumph, but with a relapse into the nightmare she thought she had escaped. The human body is a ledger. It records every trauma, every impact, every moment of stress, and every denial of care. You can try to run from the past. You can reinvent yourself. You can become Dr. Danielle Spencer, the respected veterinarian. You can hide the pain behind a white coat and a stethoscope, but eventually the ledger must be balanced. In 2004, the bill came due. Danielle was 39 years old. By all accounts, she was in the prime of her second life. She had escaped the curse of the child star. She had built a career based on compassion and intellect. But inside her spinal column, a slow geological disaster was reaching its catastrophic conclusion. It began with a numbness, a terrifying absence of sensation creeping up her legs. Then the weakness. The simple act of walking, which she had fought so hard to relearn in 1977, suddenly became a monumental task. The pain, which had been a background noise for 27 years, roared into a deafening crescendo. She was diagnosed with acute spinal stenosis. To understand the cruelty of this diagnosis, we must look back to the decision made in that boardroom in 1978. When the studio executives forced a 12-year-old girl to stand, walk, and perform on a healing spine, they weren't just causing temporary pain. They were altering the architecture of her skeleton. The trauma of the crash had damaged the discs. The forced labor had compressed them. Over the decades, the body, trying desperately to stabilize the unstable spine, had built up bone spurs and scar tissue. This calcification had slowly narrowed the spinal canal, the hollow tube that houses the spinal cord. By 2004, that canal was choking the life out of her nervous system. The irony was heartbreaking. Here was a woman who spent her days diagnosing the ailments of animals, who could look at an X-ray of a dog's spine and know exactly where the pain was coming from. Now she was looking at her own MRI and she saw the ghost of her childhood staring back at her. The injury wasn't new. It was the crash on the Pacific Coast Highway, frozen in time, finally finishing the job it started. She was paralyzed. Again. At 39, Danielle Spencer had to learn to walk for the third time in her life. First as a baby, second as a 12-year-old victim, and now as a middle-aged woman whose body was collapsing under the weight of history. The surgery to correct this was not a simple procedure. It was a salvage operation. They had to cut into her back, remove the bone that was crushing her nerves, and fuse the vertebrae together. It was a brutal, invasive reminder that she had never really left that hospital bed in 1977. She had just been on a very long, very painful furlough. If the story ended there, with the paralysis of 2004, it would already be a tragedy. But trauma is not a single event. It is a domino effect. When the body's resources are depleted fighting one war, it becomes vulnerable to others. The next decade of Danielle's life was a siege. In 2014, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent a double mastectomy. The treatment was aggressive: chemotherapy, radiation. Her body, already compromised by the spinal issues, was subjected to a new kind of poisoning in the name of a cure. And then, in 2018, the most chilling echo of the past arrived. Danielle was rushed to the hospital for emergency brain surgery. Doctors had discovered a massive hematoma, a collection of blood pooling on the surface of her brain. When we look at her medical history, we have to ask the question, was this random? Or was this the long-delayed ripple effect of the severe head trauma she suffered in the crash? Traumatic brain injury is a ghost that haunts the skull. The initial impact in 1977 caused bleeding and bruising. Over 40 years, the vascular system in her brain, perhaps weakened or altered by that initial violence, finally gave way. She survived the surgery. But look at the pattern. Look at the timeline. Spinal fracture at 12, paralysis at 39, cancer at 49, brain surgery at 53. This is not just bad luck. This is the physiological profile of a person whose body has been under constant, unremitting assault since childhood. This is what happens when a developing nervous system is subjected to catastrophic shock and then denied the peace required to reset. Throughout all of this, the surgeries, the rehab, the chemo, Danielle kept fighting. She wrote a book. She spoke out about her experiences. She tried with immense dignity to remind the world that she was still here. She refused to be a victim. She stood as a testament to the endurance of Black women who are so often asked to carry the weight of the world on broken backs. But willpower has limits. The spirit can be infinite, but the flesh is finite. On August 11th, 2025, the fight ended. Her death was the final payment on a debt she never signed up for. The industry had taken her youth. It had taken her health. And finally, it took her future. The funeral was a somber affair. There were no laugh tracks here. Just the silence of a family mourning a woman who had been in pain for 48 of her 60 years. As they laid her to rest, one couldn't help but think of Pelt, the man who died to save her in 1977. He bought her 48 years of life. And in those years, Danielle did not waste a single second. She became a healer. She became a survivor. She became a witness. But the tragedy remains. She should have had more. She should have had a life free from the cage of pain. She should have been allowed to walk without wincing. She should have been allowed to grow old. So, here we stand at the end of the dossier. We started this journey with a smile. The smile of Dee Thomas. A smile that lit up millions of living rooms. A smile that made a network rich. But now, when you look at that smile, what do you see? Do you see the joy? Or do you see the drugs masking the agony? Do you see the sass? Or do you see the terror of a child who knows she cannot stop performing? The story of Danielle Spencer is not just a Hollywood biography. It is a moral indictment. It is a mirror held up to an industry and a society that devours its young. It forces us to confront the pain gap. It forces us to admit that we, as a culture, were comfortable watching a Black child suffer because we refused to believe her pain was real. We accepted her labor, we consumed her talent, and we ignored her screams because they were hidden behind a laugh track. Danielle Spencer was a warrior, but she was a conscripted warrior. She didn't choose this battle. It was forced upon her by a system that viewed her body as property. She is gone now. The pain is finally over. The spine that was twisted by metal and greed is finally at rest. But her legacy must be more than just reruns. Her legacy must be the truth. The next time you see a child star on screen, especially a child of color, look closely. Ask yourself what is happening when the cameras stop rolling. Ask yourself who is protecting them. And remember Danielle. Remember the price she paid. She gave us her laughter. We took her life. Let that be the last thing you think about tonight.